you've written a little bit. I read a op-ed that you wrote in the Hindustan Times recently about skilling and the role that young women and adolescent girls play in the sort of skilling mission of India. Um, do you think that a lack of skills is a big barrier for the labor force participation of women? And if so, what evidence has JPAL brought to bear, or what evidence do you think needs to come out um, that relates, sort of the take up of these kinds of skilling programs? Because as there's a lot of initiatives that try to deliver skills to, for example, rural populations, vocational training programs, et cetera, that, make it fairly economically worthwhile for households to invest. And yet we see, even before the pandemic, that rates of take up of these programs were really low.
Yeah. No, again, I think that's a really good question. And I think for us, again, there are different ways of approaching this. So I think one is that skilling is definitely something that like really excites policymakers, right? So you go to anyone, whether it's with the central governments, it seems such a straightforward thing, right? But even some of the work that we have done, and even just thinking about not just for jobs angle, but also for say entrepreneurship. So thinking about training micro entrepreneurs, we do know that it is a tricky question, right? So first of all, what are some of the things on which we want to think about training? And now when we're thinking about future of work and some such themes, and increasingly we are saying that it doesn't have to be domain specific or technical, but rather thinking about soft skills, thinking about some of these other competencies that are sort of more generic, like the ability to learn, the ability to adapt. And of course, you must be aware of this evidence that again, maybe some of these things work, but they may be short term. What we know, say, from micro entrepreneurs is that many times they don't apply these, or they don't think it's very useful. They definitely don't translate into profits. They may translate into their knowledge, but they don't definitely have that impact. And then with respect to some of these programs that say in low and middle income countries that have been sort of tried these skilling programs, I think we find that more than take up, there's also this huge problem of dropouts, and then there is this other problem of actual placements, right? So I think the friction between this job search and job match is another problem. So again, like you said, I think definitely there is a way to thinking about skilling. But I think what I had tried to say in my article, which was also actually quite old, like it was, I think 2 years ago, but what I was trying to say that even our skilling programs are not thinking about by design. They are not being designed to keep the constraints and vulnerabilities faced by women and girls in low and middle income countries. And that to me actually is a central theme that I want to emphasize throughout as we go along. That one is, of course, measurement and lack of data. But the second is also that the design, like conversations or thinking through a women-centric design for anything, whether it's increased learning, increased school enrollment, skilling, jobs, everything. It's not, the women voice is not being incorporated. So that itself is where we are going wrong, So I think, because again, it's very difficult because context matters. It's really difficult to come up with this one size fit all type of approach. And this is where I feel even with skilling programs, we may have gone wrong.
That's
right.
Definitely. I absolutely agree with that. I think, in some sense, the programs like DDU GKY, other programs that, provide rural populations with skills and then kind of match them up with jobs in mostly urban centers. Those kinds of programs, do tend to get some of the pieces right in terms of, it's not just about skill provision, it's also about the job match and the fact that there may be large search costs for these people to try to get a job, hundreds of miles away in a city. So let's make that, a frictionless process for them as much as possible. But of course, we know that, when it comes to women, there are additional barriers that need to be considered. And often these programs, I absolutely agree that, the design doesn't take into account those potentially kind of particularly strong barriers to adoption that women might face.
Yeah.
And I think there's, of course, a key role for experimentation, in the design of these programs that particularly target those barriers. We're doing some work in rural Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh
Okay.
that evaluates opportunities for women through DUGKY. And
Okay.
our initial kind of piloting work around this, as well as household survey work, led to really a reconsidering on our part of the value of these programs as they're currently designed, because as you mentioned, at every step in this process, women are dropping out of the program, and
Yeah.
rates are extremely high.
Yeah.
So for every 100 women that you enroll, maybe only 4 or 5 actually make it to Bangalore or another big city context to actually take up work. So in addition to being not such a great feature for the program and for the women who are enrolled, um, it's also just not a great use of government dollars, of taxpayer dollars,
Yeah.
to
Absolutely.
that you're
Absolutely.
spending money on skilling when you're not going to get a huge yield from that. So it's really important then to think through the design. How in this context in particular, I wanted to sort of pick your brain about how COVID and the changing landscape in terms of both the economy, but also rural to urban migration. Um, how do you think that influences this idea of program design? Because one thing that we found in follow-up surveys during the early stages of the pandemic, at least in April and May, was that when we contacted these same households that we had approached about the program initially, something like 90% of them said that they are extremely unlikely to be sending any female household member to a city anytime soon.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
um, if that's the case, then does that, further erode the potential value of this kind of skilling program?
Yeah. No, I think this is. I'm so glad that you share this because that's exactly been our finding as well. So some of our researchers, Clement and Bird, they also used the sampling frame of the work they had been doing with the DGU GKY participants in, I think it is Bihar and Jharkhand, and I think they found exactly the same, that the women or the female participants were much less likely to go back, even when once the situation was fine. So to me, I think this is going to be a huge, this is a huge cost for us, because I think one of the things that we also have to understand is that over and above, like there could be an information gap, there could be a skill gap, but then there is also the fact that there are these norms, right? There are these norms that are really underlying how much women can actually do in India's, and they also play a role in other countries, but I'll just talk about India. And so I think for a woman to actually have gone outside, is somewhere she has challenged the existing norms, she has taken that support whatever from the household, and then when they go there and they have this kind of an experience, which happened when the lockdown was announced and the migrants really faced a lot of issues. I
Yeah.
think then there is a lot more, so we're almost kind of going back to where we were with this. So I think this is going to then, but then what that really means is that as we build back, we have to then think about really trying to do a lot more to continuously encourage this. And I think this is somewhere I think the firms can also really start playing a role to say that, okay, again, on the one hand, especially when we think about service sector and all, we can say that, with the pandemic, the work from home, the adoption of technology, these could be the silver linings. But then we also know that there are these additional issues of the additional burden and all of that, right? So to me, it just seems that whatever the COVID-19 pandemic has revealed to us with that were the problems with the existing structures, but they have also maybe led people to be more cautious than before, to really think about, going back in a way. So we need to really, as we rethink about it, we will have to do more, sort of, is what I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, this also sort of brings to the fore potential ways to either reach into villages to sort of expand supply chains. There's already a lot of kind of work that goes on in terms of handicrafts and, certain parts of production processes like embroidery, for example, is often done sort of in rural contexts because you can do this kind of within the home or within a local factory where you don't need large capital investment. Um,
Mm.
but a lot of production, for good reason mostly, but it still happens in a
Yeah.
consolidated
Yeah.
factory or firm environment, and requires people to come to work, right? How much do you think the pandemic and the sort of ensuing ripple effects that we're going to see over the years to come is going to make more important the role of things like the graduation programs and the work that you are doing, and that JPAL researchers have shown to be extremely beneficial in Bihar and other places, uh, as well as kind of the idea that finding innovative ways to involve more rural labor in the production process could be beneficial to rural women and rural households.
Yeah, so I think this whole thing of rural supply chains, while I agree, I think that's definitely a pathway where we could do a lot more. I think we all also know that for true economic progress, I mean, cities are the place, right? And migration to, to a lot of extent is an aspirational choice that people are making for a better future, right? So I do think that here, the role of social protection is going to be really, really important. So I think, and the social protection, and again, this is different from sort of what the firms can do. So that's a totally different kind of a separate thing. But from the government side, I think what this pandemic has also shown is that despite huge investments into trying to build a robust social protection architecture, we have sort of still failed in terms of still having these exclusion errors, still trying to, and especially with migrant workers, like them not having this identity in the cities, and that makes cities such a difficult place for them to survive, and their day-to-day wages are cut off, they have no place to sleep, they have nothing to eat. That's really pushed the government into thinking about designing, like, say, one nation one card type of a strategy, that at least the access to food remains even when these people are going. uh, but I think that's where I feel a lot can still be done. So even with graduation approach, I think the point that I have tried to make with the work that we did during the pandemic was that for the government of Bihar, because they adopted the the graduation approach as a formal part of their social protection system, it allowed them to reach people that they would have otherwise never been able to reach, because they are the poorest of the poor, they are on the margin. So you now have a database, you have their bank accounts, you have access to them.
Right.
So I think even from the perspective of encouraging women to go, to continue to go, I think a lot has to be done in terms of thinking about other options, whether it's affordable housing, rental housing for women, women hostels, right? Like, I mean, that even in Bangladesh, a lot of this, it's the whole garment industry in Bangladesh, it is women are the engines and drivers of that, right? And so
Yeah.
I think that a lot can be done from the social protection lens as well, of course, over and above trying to think about other ways of encouraging and designing your skills program better.
Absolutely, yeah, I think that's right, and yeah, especially you know, uh, in the first kind of phase of recovery, I think we're already seeing some of that household survey follow-up work that I was telling you about, and I think JPAL and IPA and other organizations have basically shown very similar statistics, but we saw huge increases in food insecurity and and a decrease in consumption and expenditures as a result of the pandemic and the lockdowns. And there's very little evidence, at least in the early stages of the pandemic, that government transfers were making it through in the way that they should. And so thinking about how do you make sure that social protections not only exist but also make it to these rural places, and that people are either getting their checks or getting access to programs in a real meaningful way. That's, I think, a real big implementation challenge as well.
Yeah.